quite a treasure trove, especially as we not only engage within the 7 areas of the Special Act, but also our special guests from the labs, as well as people here in the community on environmental justice and just transition. So really good, rich content out there. So let's go to slide 3, Strategen team. Just a quick overview of the meeting agenda for today. And everyone's really familiar. We're getting close here to the end of the process. So we're just going to do, Sridhar is going to give us an intro from HiAxiom to set us off. And then we're going to work through the meeting minutes from our last meeting, and then really jump into the meat of the agenda, which is really exciting, right? This is the time when we're going to be working through all the findings of the working groups and members of the task force, and then initiating a conversation on the recommendations as well. So the agenda is really focused in there as we look ahead at January 15th, the due date for the findings and recommendations to the Committee of Cognizance, which is the Energy and Technology Committee here in the Connecticut General Assembly. We'll work through next steps, and then we'll take public comments. So anybody who's out there who has public comments, feel free to chat them through. Let the Strategen team know that you have comments, just so we can keep track of that. That would be great. Okay, so why don't we turn it over to our hosts here today, Sridhar and HiAxiom.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you to the entire task force for joining us here today at HiAxiom in South Windsor, Connecticut. I will go through introduce some of our team members that are here, and then quickly go into a 10-minute pitch on our presentation. Before we start all of that, I would like Eric to talk about safety as we go through the factory tour today. He's our EHS manager for both our plant and also our product.
Morning. First of all, welcome to our facility. We are an active manufacturing facility, so there are fork trucks and personnel moving around. During your facility tour, for those who are here with us, we will ensure your safety. Behind us is a table with safety glasses, so we'll have you wear a pair of those as we go along. We'll continue to communicate what's happening in the facility, but our goal here is for you to have a nice, healthy, and safe visit of our facility. We have 2 buildings on campus, so we'll travel between the 2 during our walk. This building specifically, we manufacture some of our parts with a graphite material. It tends to be slippery from time to time, so depending on your footwear, it may be a little slippery. So I would advise you to stay on the carpeted spaces. You have much better traction there. And again, we'll make sure that our visit is nice and safe. Should there be an emergency, there will be an alarm system. We'll leave this room here and we'll take a left, and immediately in front of us will be an exit door. We'll follow that out to the main entrance, where we'll take a head count there. Very much.
Great. Before I start off on the HiAxiom introduction, let me introduce some of the key people that are here from HiAxiom. We have Linda from our marketing and communications department. Have Brian Chukulski, he's the director of our engineering. Jackie, she's a program manager that is responsible for entire product cost for the organization. We have Mike Letirio, he's our fuel processing and hydrogen systems manager. And then we have David, most of you guys know, is our government relations. So we have limited time, so I'll quickly get started on HiAxiom. Very brief overview of who we are. We are part of Doosan Corporation. It is a global organization with close to 30,000 employees across the world. And HiAxiom is 100% owned by Doosan. So on the blue, you see HiAxiom there. We are a US entity, and the key technologies we work on, our core product is phosphoric acid fuel cells. Then we have PEM fuel cells, which we are also investigating for transportation applications. We are looking at electrolyzers for the Korean market. We have a few pilots that we are demonstrating as of today. And then a subsidiary of HiAxiom in Korea is Doosan H2 Innovation. And these guys are actively developing our next generation solid oxide products. They are 100% subsidiary of HiAxiom. And we have a team there that is actively doing that work in Korea on the solid oxide. The other divisions of Doosan, the most well-known one in the United States is Doosan Bobcat. So Doosan 100% owns Bobcat in the US. And also Enerbility. This was previously Doosan Heavy Industries. And these guys are primarily into building nuclear power plants in Asia and Europe. And as part of Enerbility, they have subsidiaries, Doosan Skoda Power, which is in Czech Republic, and they do mostly steam turbines for nuclear power plants. And we recently sold off Babcock in the past 2 months, but those guys do very similar work. They build nuclear plants and also steam turbines in the UK. And then Enerbility itself does nuclear plants and thermal plants in Korea and rest of Asia. So that is one part of the business. Hyaxium is mostly hydrogen and fuel cells. And then the other businesses that we have are Electromaterials Business Group. These guys make copper clad laminates for cell phones. Basically, it looks like most of the Samsung and Apple phones where the processors are printed on the copper is made by this organization. And then there are a few other consumer related businesses as part of Doosan Group. So that is the parent company. And now coming to Hyaxium. Hyaxium was previously part of United Technologies. We were called UTC Power. And UTC Power started off in the area of fuel cells, making fuel cells for the space mission. So as you walked into this building, the empty hallway with the blue walls, that's where the Apollo fuel cells were made. So it is a piece of history, but it's empty today. And the notable thing is the astronauts that went to the moon drank the water that came from that fuel cell. So that's how the business started. And then all of the US manned space mission fuel cells were also made in this building until the Space Shuttle Orbiter was dismantled in 2011. Using that history and background, we transitioned to making stationary fuel cells. So in early 90s, we launched the 200 kilowatt phosphoric acid fuel cell. And we introduced them into multiple locations. Over 300 of them were sold across the world. And the one at Mohegan Sun Casino in Connecticut was the longest running fuel cell ever on the same stack and the same fuel processor. So it ran for 84,000 hours, and then it was decommissioned maybe in 2012. So that provided power to the casino and also the hot water and heating application. So it ran very efficient. It was close to 90% efficiency because of the way the customer used all of the heat coming out of the system. And then we ventured into making fuel cells for bus applications as part of United Technologies. So a bunch of these fuel cells were launched in Connecticut, California. I think the California bus fuel cell was, again, the longest running fuel cell as part of what UTC made. It ran 30,000 hours or something. I don't know where it is today. 2 years ago, we got reports that it was still running, but I really don't know where it is today. We lost touch with it. And then using that history is how we made the current product that is manufactured in this facility, which is the 440 kilowatt phosphoric acid fuel cell. And then Doosan acquired us in 2014. And post that, we expanded this business to include manufacturing in the US. We replicated the same thing in Korea. And now as the total Doosan entities, we manufacture around 110 to 120 megawatts of fuel cells every year. Roughly 40% here, 60% in Korea. Okay. So I'll quickly go into a key description of our product. So shown here on to the left-hand side is our core product, which is our phosphoric acid fuel cell power plant. It is PureCell Model 400. And it can operate on 3 different fuels. Natural gas is our baseline product, which is the unit that has been deployed the most. 90+% of our product is natural gas based. But we have applications also. So there is another variant of this which operates on LPG, which we have deployed in Korea and has been running a unit has run for a few years, and then subsequent contract we had in Korea, we've just commissioned an entire site of 12 megawatts in Korea on LPG. Then we have another variant of this, which is a hydrogen-based power plant. So as hydrogen picks up, we can transform this power plant to operate on pure hydrogen. So if you look at the left-hand side, where the blue arrow at the bottom comes in, it shows natural gas, LPG, or hydrogen. And then there is a blue box on top that you can see, which is called the fuel processor. So for natural gas or fossil fuel-based units, we have the fuel processor in the system. And then for the hydrogen-based unit, that fuel processor can be removed and made it into a hydrogen power plant. So a lot of the customers that we're talking to today, without the hydrogen infrastructure, they can put the natural gas power plant on site, and then at some point in future, when hydrogen becomes available, they can easily transition this to run on pure hydrogen by removing the front section of the power. On natural gas, the unit has an electrical efficiency of 43%, and on hydrogen, the unit has an electrical efficiency of 51%. The combined heat and power efficiency of both of these systems is 90% if the customer uses all of the heat that comes out of it. But majority of our customers in both Korea and the US harness 60–70% of the heat. So they get up to like 70–75% combined heat and power efficiency, which is our common application today. Okay, so from a scale perspective, where do we stand? We have 508 megawatts in South Korea deployed and running. Most of these are utility-based applications. In the US, we have 57 megawatts. Rest of the world, we have 3 megawatts. And we have a few units in the UK and a bunch of units in China. So close to 3 megawatts is what we have today. So some of our applications that we have across the world are shown here. On the top left corner is the Yukon unit. It's a 460 kilowatt LNG based unit. Below that is a unit at Sheraton Hotel in San Diego, California. And then Coca-Cola in East Hartford. We have 2 units running there. At the bottom is Lotte Tower in South Korea, where we have a unit in the basement, 2 units in the basement. Then we have a bunch of units close to 2.4 megawatts at CBS in California. And on the right-hand side are all utility-based applications. These are multi-megawatt applications that we put out in support of the utilities, especially in Korea. So the bottom one there, KHNP, 30.8 megawatts, that runs on LNG. The one above it, SK, 12 megawatts, that runs on LPG. And then the very top one, which is 50 megawatts, one of our largest installations, it runs on pure hydrogen. It's at a petrochemical complex in Korea, and they've had excess hydrogen come off. They didn't have use for it. So we were able to work with the customer to use that hydrogen, put it into our fuel cells, and get 50 megawatts of power with it. And this has been in operation for 3 years right now. So it's the world's largest pure hydrogen-based installation that we have. So we've talked about some customer applications. These are the key customers that we have in the US and in Korea. I won't go into details, but you can see it's a varied list of customers with data centers to utilities to a single unit applications at grocery stores and other commercial buildings. Finally, all of these units are monitored 24/7. The monitoring is based off our control center, where each and every power plant is monitored. You get close to 1,500 data points from each unit every second. And then there are a significant number of algorithms we do in the background to understand how the power plant is behaving, and then use that to define our service procedures. Instead of just sending a service technician at a fixed interval to a site, we can tailor our service application to ensure that the customer is taken care of any issues based on the data we get. That is pretty much what I had as an overview for the organization. Again, thank you for everyone for being here. Any questions, comments?
Sridhar, thank you for that. There was a question that came over. I don't know, Jen or Stratagen team, if you can relay that question, or here it is. We're up here.
Yeah, absolutely. I can read that out, Brian. We got a question. Are typical units operating on LNG, as noted on the slides, or natural gas from the LDC pipeline?
Yeah, well, I've said LNG, or we've used that interchangeably, but it is natural gas. So either LNG or pipeline natural gas is what we operate these units on.
You know, let me, if I could follow up with that. Has there been any experience with using hydrogen blended with natural gas as a fuel source for the fuel cells? Have you demoed that or had any experience with that?
Yeah, we don't have direct experience yet in the field with it, but we do have experience with the product itself being able to do that. At this point today, the baseline natural gas unit can operate on 30% hydrogen blended in.
Thank you.
All right. Sridhar, thank you. That was great. We're looking forward to the tour. Those of you who are online, sorry you won't be able to join us, but we're looking forward to with your team and getting a tour later on of the plant here. Let's keep working through the agenda. So we've got the approval of the meeting minutes for November 8th. For those of you who have read through them, I read through them. I wanted to thank Wheezy and the crew at Dominion and Millstone for an excellent presentation. For those of you who didn't see it, I would suggest you see it. It's probably the 5-minute best presentation on how the regional system works and how Millstone plugs into that. So I really, again, it's online. You can read it, you can watch it. So thank you, Wheezy, for hosting us with your team there. It was great. And then a big shout out to Aziz Dekan as well, who joined the fireside chat on Just Transition. Again, both very good sessions. But any questions, comments on the meeting minutes? Does somebody want to move the approval of the meeting minutes? Great, thank you, Ur. Is there a second?
Second.
Great, thank you, Sridhar. Questions, comments? All right, motion to approve the meeting minutes. Feel free to raise your hand, say yes online. Those who approve say yay. Any nays? Any
Yay
abstain?
from Joel.
Gotcha. You're a nay or an abstention? Or an A?
Joel is a yay.
Yay, got you.
And
Thanks,
Tony
Joel.
is a yay.
Any nays? Any abstentions? All right, great set of meeting minutes. Thank you, Stratagen team, for assembling that. Okay, Aaron, it's that time. I'm gonna transfer it over to you, and here we go. Big part.
Thank you so much, Brian. So just as we get started here, I just really want to thank all of the task force members, all of the folks who showed up to work group meetings. It has been just a real pleasure to be working with all of you. And we're very excited to be sharing today our findings and draft recommendations. It's going to be, I think, really fun to see all of the work group material on the same page, if you will, and give folks a chance to see some of the continuity and themes that have been cutting across a number of different work groups, and give folks a chance to kind of see all of that come together, just in terms of how this body of research has been giving us a fuller picture of hydrogen in Connecticut and some of the opportunities that folks are seeing. So we'll start out with those findings, and then and those will be mostly pulling from material that's already been shared in work group meetings. So if you've been along for the whole ride, please, bear with us as we get everyone up to speed who hasn't been able to attend all those meetings. And then we'll be stepping into recommendations. And so these recommendations are still hot off the press, everyone. We've been working very hard to get the latest and greatest in front of everyone. So definitely on the recommendations, we're really, really interested to hear feedback and input from folks. This is sort of really the final phase for this task force effort. And so giving everyone a chance to chime in on these recommendations, I think, is a big goal of ours today. But we will be pausing throughout the presentation to create space for questions, clarify anything that folks want to stop and spend time on. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. Shannon, you're such a model participant. Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, or to drop any questions in the chat. And Shannon, with that, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Shannon Lawn from Conservation Law Foundation. I was wondering if you could walk us through the process of providing feedback on the findings and recommendations. Like, for example, will we be provided that language like as a Word document that we could provide track changes, suggestions, and comments and that sort of thing?
Yes, you are skipping ahead to my next step slides, but since those are in 90 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and give you a preview. But we will be providing some opportunity for written feedback. We will be taking feedback during our upcoming work groups. We'll be taking feedback during this meeting. So our goal really is to create plenty of space for feedback, recommendations, specific wording changes even. So please, this is your time. Come speak up. Let us know what you think. So thank you, Shannon. That was a great question. Okay. Any other table setting questions before we kick off here? Okay. Well, with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So just a brief reminder for everyone, we set out, the Special Act set out 7 specific areas of study for Connecticut's economy and energy infrastructure, focused on regulations, legislation to guide the development of hydrogen economy of scale, recommendations for workforce initiatives to prepare those jobs, some thinking on how the state should be positioning itself to take advantage of competitive incentives and how to participate in some of these federal funding opportunities, funding and tax preferences specifically to leverage the Targeted Brownfield Development Grant and Loan Program, potential funding sources for energy programs or infrastructure, as well as examination of sources for clean hydrogen, looking at wind, solar, biogas, and nuclear, and end uses for hydrogen energy. So we're going to be touching on all of these today and sort of talking folks through how we've been approaching some of these imperatives. And we've also been touching a little bit on some of the hydrogen infrastructure pieces, enabling infrastructure that folks felt was a pretty important addition. Just one reminder on the next slide that all of these recommendations, oh, excuse me, wrong slide. This is perfect. So the key findings that we're going to be talking through at the beginning are all based on research, technical analysis, right? So this is information that has come from looking very deeply at some of the federal funding programs. It's come from doing some original analysis on hydrogen costs or availability based on public data sets. It's based on some of the great feedback and recommendations and resources that everyone has given us. I know we got just another really great download from everyone in the last round of written comments. So thank you everyone for putting so much time and energy into those comments. There's some really rich content there that we're still digesting. But this is sort of the key findings, right? This is a technical analysis. This is a fact base, right? So think of it that way. Now, when we move to recommendations, These recommendations are being very much based on the findings and the feedback, but they are taking the next step to be starting to think about potential actions that can be undertaken within the state to help advance this clean hydrogen economy. And one of the things we felt was really important as we were putting these recommendations together is making sure that there was a little bit of clarity on how some of this should be advanced. And so we've broken down our recommendations into actions to be taken by the legislature, by state government agencies, and then by industry and academia. So when we get to that step, definitely welcome any feedback that folks have on that. But just to give you kind of a sense of the difference between the findings and the recommendations. Next slide. This is the slide that I was trying to speak to earlier, but just a brief reminder to folks that we did, as we were thinking about these recommendations, want to make sure that we were very much in compliance with the policy guiding principles that were laid out at the very start of this effort. And so we just wanted to put those in front of everyone as a little reminder that we definitely felt that there was a really strong need to be in compliance with state statutes and regulations, or identify where those would need to be changed, right, to enable compliance. We want to make sure that we're aligning with state policy and active regulatory proceedings. There's a lot of people out there who are doing a lot of work, and our goal is to be harmonizing with that work and making sure that the recommendations we're providing here are supportive of that work, as opposed to in any way creating confusion or conflicts with some of these ongoing policy efforts. We also want to make sure that we're thinking about sort of underlying policy and regulatory challenges or potential enablers. We're talking about, hydrogen is a pretty big concept, and potentially has some pretty big changes to how we're thinking about energy supply. And so while we do want to identify specific opportunities, we also want to acknowledge places where those fundamental foundational pieces are really impactful. We're also, as I said, we got the big picture pieces of, hey, what are the big things you need to be thinking about? And we also want to be acknowledging, hey, there's active work going on specific issues, and how this work is going to be aligning with that. And then last, but definitely not least, I think we've heard so loudly from everyone that there is such interest to stay engaged on this and to create space for the whole variety of voices that have showed up to this task force. And so making sure that there are appropriate processes for review, vetting, stakeholder engagement. We want to make sure that folks continue to have space for their voices to be heard and to contribute to decision-making processes. So with that little intro, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleagues to start walking you all through some of the key findings. So first, Colin, would love to get you up here talking us through sources, uses, and infrastructure.
Thanks, Erin. Great to meet everyone. I think you've seen me on a number of these calls already, but my name is Colin Smith, and I've been managing the uses, sources, and infrastructure working group, which are all very interconnected, which I think you'll see as we go through some of the findings. But jumping onto the next slide, we can get started with some of those key findings. In the interest of time, I won't read through each of these individually, but just to signpost some of the themes that we'll be looking at in the slides to follow. We'll be looking at the relevance of infrastructure, or the relevance of scaling up hydrogen infrastructure in order to create sort of a cost-effective distribution system for hydrogen in Connecticut. We'll be looking at the need for clean energy to produce hydrogen, the implications that has for Connecticut's clean energy goals, taking into account some already very large renewable energy capacity needs that Connecticut has identified just to decarbonize the other sectors of its economy, like the electricity sector. We'll be looking at some of the most abundant, lowest cost sources for clean hydrogen local to Connecticut, identifying some of the importance of infrastructure to cost effectively deliver hydrogen to end users, and the relevance and value of state or federal funding to support some of that infrastructure. So quick overview of kind of where we're going. And I think now we can move on to the next slide to get into some of that. So first, taking a step back, we wanted to reiterate kind of the importance of hydrogen and the reason why we're looking at this technology for Connecticut. Hydrogen, when it's low or zero carbon, can provide an important tool to address decarbonization in Connecticut in a way that addresses the issues, interrelated issues of energy equity, energy justice, and a sustainable and just transition to clean energy in the state. You can see here in the map some of the larger potential users of hydrogen in the power sector and industrial sector, where they're located in Connecticut and where they're located relative to some of the more important communities to serve in the state, environmental justice communities and distressed municipalities. So just giving a quick snapshot of kind of the scene, setting the stage, understanding where things are located within the state and how that speaks to the importance of affecting this transition in a just and equitable manner. Jumping on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about those end use.
Colin, I think you're muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. Accidentally pressed the space bar. Yeah, so the end uses that we looked at in the demand analysis were focused on highest priority end uses that were identified through a robust stakeholder process and extensive research. I won't go through each end use individually. They've been spoken to at past working groups and task force meetings, but looking at the highest priority for additional investigation end uses, these are the end uses that have a high potential to drive demand for hydrogen over the long term due to either due to both the scale of the particular sector and or the underlying economics. These are sectors where the economics for hydrogen are quite strong and where the potential to use large amounts of hydrogen are perhaps also particularly large as well. We'll have in that list critical facilities that require 24-hour backup need, aviation, transoceanic cargo shipping, material handling with long uptimes that would be difficult to electrify, long-haul heavy-duty trucks, high-heat industrial processes, and then also fuel cells for peak power generation. That last one being sort of the use case in which hydrogen is used as seasonal energy storage, hydrogen being produced via renewable energy, including excess renewable energy stored and then used to produce energy in the future when renewable energy supplies are low and where dispatchable clean renewable sources are particularly in need. And so these are the items that are included in the demand analysis that we'll investigate in a bit more detail in the next slide. So as mentioned, the demand analysis was focused on the end uses of the highest potential to impact demand for hydrogen over the long term. And the way we approached this was looking at, taking into account those end uses, what's the maximum potential demand that Connecticut could feasibly need to serve in a future where the state was very ambitious in developing a hydrogen economy within the states. And the reason why we looked at a maximum potential demand is sort of twofold. One is because there's been a lot of discussion about the potential need for Connecticut to import hydrogen to meet some of its needs. And so this is really a way to test, if Connecticut really went all out on hydrogen, what would that mean in terms of its ability to service that maximum load with regional or in-state resources? The other is because Connecticut or hydrogen as an industry really benefits from the economies of scale. Building out hydrogen infrastructure, as many stakeholders have mentioned in comments, written comments in this proceeding, is quite expensive. And so it really only makes sense if you can levelize the costs of that infrastructure over a large volume of demand. And so this could kind of be seen as, what volume of demand could Connecticut feasibly support if it were to try to create a situation which you could drive down the cost of hydrogen infrastructure by levelizing it over a large volume of sales. And as you can see here in this slide, the two applications that are really likely to drive large volumes of hydrogen use are power generation, long-haul trucking, coming in at above 150 kilotons per year. Maritime shipping and aviation, also relatively large contributions. Material handling, critical facilities and industry, much smaller, largely because of the nature of those industries and their place in Connecticut's economy. But given that a lot of these industries will likely be using hydrogen because of the underlying economics and difficulty of identifying alternative decarbonization solutions for these industries, they still are likely to contribute to demand in the future as well. So jumping on the next slide, we can kind of get a view of how much demand we're looking at overall. You can see in the graph on the right, the x-axis shows the total demand the aggregate demand across all of the end uses that were identified, coming in at just under 400 kilotons per year. Then on the y-axis, you can kind of see the price points that hydrogen need to hit in order to be economically viable against the prevailing fossil fuel that is currently used in that industry. And a couple of takeaways from this graph are listed on the left. The big one being economics for hydrogen are strongest where hydrogen replaces bunker fuel or diesel. These are the applications like maritime shipping, critical facilities, long-haul trucks, and maritime material handling. In these situations, if the cost of the ancillary infrastructure required to deliver hydrogen to end users can be kept down, then it's highly likely that hydrogen could be competitive against the incumbent fossil fuel in the future. The price points for hydrogen to replace applications that use natural gas, like power generation industry, are more difficult to hit, but they still may be the lowest cost option compared to the next best decarbonization option for these particular resources. Similar with aviation, very challenging economics to hit, but are more likely in the future to be driven by policy and industry targets than necessarily direct competition with hydrogen on a cost per unit of energy basis. I'll pause here because that was a lot of information, and I want to give everyone a chance to answer any or pose any questions or ask for any clarification or provide any thoughts they may have on these findings.
And these findings are specifically to the uses that are outlined in the statute. So lots of research and work done here by that working group and the technical analysis here of Stratagen. But questions, comments, I saw a hand. There's Tony.
Tony, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so this is all in Connecticut demand. In other words, in Connecticut today, we're doing a certain amount of long haul maritime shipping fueling. There are and that's diesel, and we're talking about replacing it with hydrogen.
Yes, this is specific to Connecticut and also scaled up over time based on expected growth rates in these industries.
So that aviation fuel, that's like Bradley and maybe the smaller airports transitioning to hydrogen fuel.
Correct.
Okay. And is there a written report coming that will sort of lay out the assumptions and so forth?
Yes, there absolutely is.
Okay, that's going to take a lot of work, but thank you for that.
Of course.
Thank you, Leo. Great questions. Or Tony, great questions. Colin, we've got, yes, a question in the chat. Yes. Colin, you want me to read this one to you, or can you see it? You want to read it out?
Yeah, I see it. This is a very good question. Yes, the target price would be $1 per kilogram. That's because natural gas is quite cheap, and getting hydrogen to be that cheap is also is very challenging. And this is why I noted that in these situations, the comparison will likely not be with natural gas, but likely with the next best decarbonization option. So for power generation specifically, in a future grid with high penetration of renewables, it's likely that things like gas turbines or dispatchable generation will largely be used to fill in the gaps for when renewable energy is not available. And in that case, what matters is less the fuel price, but the price of capacity that and how valuable that flexibility is to the electricity markets. And so, this is in a representative graph that was included all the end uses for in the interest of comprehensiveness, but really the economic decisions being made by actors in these markets are very different because the markets are very different in these different end uses.
Good morning, everyone. Alex Isaac from FuelCell Energy. Thank you for taking my question. I saw in the presentation, and there might be more to come that incorporates this, but my thought is when looking at the various timelines that you've put out in the charts so far, they're very informative, but one that I thought that might be beneficial, particularly to the legislature, which is who this report is going to, is one that creates a timeline and puts all of the aggregate amount of demand into one timeline. So I see what's on the screen now, just looks broadly out to 2050. But on a previous slide, you had it broken up by usage segments, generation, aviation, you had others, and you had 3 bars, one for each decade, if you will. Curious to know if you're thinking about maybe putting an aggregate slide in there that combines all of the various application types so that if the legislature is looking at this, they could say to themselves, okay, in the next 5 years, we need to put policy in place so that the end result, regardless of what usage it may be, because that's a little bit of a moving target depending on consumer preference and some other issues that we're going to have to be talking about. But on average, we think Connecticut is going to need to be able to produce X amount of hydrogen by 2030. And I would recommend even breaking it down further, not just doing it in 10-year timeframes, but maybe 5. Just to give them a realistic approach to kind of how quickly we need to be putting the regulatory structure in place to fully support, the rollout, if you will, of a hydrogen economy in the state of Connecticut.
Thank you. That's helpful feedback, and we can definitely that definitely wouldn't be hard to do. Okay. Well, if there no, Erin.
No, I was just going to say, I think this was the chart that was being discussed, but I think we also just got a great tee up to step into some of the sources questions that you've been looking at, Colin, since the question of will we have enough energy, I think has been front and center for a lot of folks.
Absolutely. So yes, jumping to the next slide, we can start talking about that, because one challenge of scaling hydrogen production is sourcing enough electricity and clean electricity to make sure that you can produce enough hydrogen in a zero carbon methodology. And this is particularly important given that Connecticut already has identified a number of incremental installations for renewable energy that would be required to meet its general decarbonization targets, including its zero carbon electricity system by 2040 targets. And looking at some of the renewable energy potentials in Connecticut, you can see that offshore wind and solar kind of come across as the largest in terms of a technical potential to scale up to accommodate a new industry like hydrogen. We have here in the chart the technical potentials for production of different types of resources in or near, within range of Connecticut. In addition, on the green bar, we see the energy installations, the capacity installations that would be required, the energy that would be required annually to reach Connecticut's general decarbonization goals by 2040. And so the difference between those two bars is sort of the available energy or available capacity that could conceivably be used to produce hydrogen without getting in the way of Connecticut's other clean energy targets. So jumping to the next slide, we can kind of see what that aggregates to in terms of overall production potential. So here we show a supply projection, a sort of mid-case, base case supply projection, supply curve for Connecticut, identifying the technical potential to produce hydrogen with resources in and around Connecticut. And you can see a couple of things. First, the technical potential for hydrogen production in Connecticut is technically quite large. There's enough resources identified to produce close to 5 million metric tons of hydrogen in and around Connecticut. You can see on the graph that the largest potential comes from offshore wind and solar, which are also some of the cheapest options that are available. It is possible to get cheaper hydrogen produced from onshore wind and potentially nuclear, but those supplies are more limited. In addition, applications like biogas and excess renewable energy are also available, but also more limited in supply and potentially more costly. The curtailed renewable energy or producing hydrogen from excess renewable energy is worth calling out because that's definitely an application that hydrogen should be used for to turn renewable energy that otherwise would be curtailed into a usable fuel like hydrogen. But ultimately, even though the expected curtailment rates in Connecticut under a high renewable future are going to be quite large, it's likely not possible to support all of the end uses that are identified using curtailed or otherwise curtailed energy alone. You're really looking at tapping into some of the resources that are endemic to Connecticut, and those are really offshore wind and solar providing the best potential options. I see a hand from Shannon. Happy to pause and take that.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, did you take into account which of these renewable resources have RECs associated with them to prevent double counting? So for example, if there's an existing renewable project that sold the RECs to another entity, then you can't then use that to produce green hydrogen, or you'd be double counting those renewable attributes. So does that factor into this analysis?
Not into this analysis. This is strictly a technical potential, looking at the overall ability to produce electricity from these different resources. But going down one step deeper, which is definitely something Connecticut would need to do in the future, that's the type of considerations that are important to keep in mind and investigate fully.
And is that going to be covered in these recommendations?
I believe that I'll defer to Aaron there actually about who will be presenting the recommendations section. Maybe best to hold off on discussion of that question until we get to the draft recommendations. But these are draft recommendations, so if they are not included in those in the set as it's currently identified, there's opportunity to edit before they finally go to the legislature.
Okay, thank you. And just for the record, I recommend that we do include these considerations in the recommendations. Thanks.
Thank you. I see another hand up from, looks like, I can't see the name in my chat, but.
Yeah, good morning. It's Sebastian from Avangrid. So two questions. Number one is, have you accounted for the technical, acres in amount of land required to all, connect all this solar? And second, when I see the levelized cost of hydrogen, are you accounting for or assuming that an electrolyzer is directly connected to these solar projects? And if so, the capacity factor is very low, which means, technically your cost of hydrogen is just going to be through the roof, right? Or are you accounting these solar in offshore and other resources already connected to the network, and therefore you're incorporating the cost of T&D charges?
So taking those questions in turn, one, yes, we are taking into account the land uses, the land requirements to put this solar into place. These technical potentials are from NREL supply curves, which take into account available land, as well as a number of restrictions on placing solar in urban areas, setbacks from existing buildings, inability to build in forests, things like that. In terms of direct connection, yes, in these cases, we're looking at the electrolyzer being connected directly to a solar plant, or in the case of offshore wind, perhaps through a PPA style agreement. For solar, the direct connection to the plant in question would not necessarily require T&D upgrades because it would be a direct connection. However, as you mentioned, it would mean that the capacity factors for the electrolyzer are quite small, which is certainly a trade-off when you're looking at dedicated renewable energy options. That said, the ability to bypass the T&D costs that would be required to take power from the market, our analysis shows that even with those very low capacity factors, it does not make the cost of hydrogen astronomical, and especially when taking into account the incentives that are available through the IRA, you can still get hydrogen produced at under $2 per kilogram, even with those capacity factors that are that low. However, I think that this is a good opportunity to point out that we looked at all of these applications sort of in isolation, hydrogen connected to solar, hydrogen connected to offshore wind, hydrogen connected to curtailed power. In reality, developers will probably be mixing and matching supplies. So you might have a situation which solar hydrogen connects directly to a solar plant, but also has a PPA with an offshore wind installation so that it can continue to produce when the sun is down, but when offshore wind is being produced at night. Or they might have a situation where you're connected to a solar plant to produce during the day, but also connected to the grid so that you can utilize excess renewable energy that would otherwise be curtailed that's not correlated with the load of that solar installation. And so there's a lot of other, as projects are actually being put into development, these are the types of questions and kind of optimization problems that a lot of developers and producers will be working to solve, and that will likely drive down the ultimate cost of hydrogen even more.
Well, thank you. And I would love to see the math behind that. And as a developer, to be really honest with you, I have a hard time getting to those numbers when you incorporate real life, practical constraints of a network and costs and tariffs and so on. But so if there's more detail on the assumptions and the math behind it, would be great to see it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem. Yeah, so I think in the interest of time, sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
So we've got one, I know we have two other hands raised. So I know that, yes, we're running on the clock, but maybe we can go through these two first, Sarah and then Sridhar.
Right. So this is a question from in the room, and it might be inspired by a couple things. It has to do with the last chart on slide 16, where we're looking at solar, wind, onshore, offshore. But digging back into the sixth part of the special act that includes biomass and nuclear. So I'm wondering if we can create a nuclear curve here, really kind of inspired by having read the minutes and thinking back on what was included in the minutes from the presentation at Dominion. I think something along the lines of 55% of the capacity is sold into Connecticut through long-term contracts, which we're now benefiting from as a result of rising natural gas prices, which begs the question of one, where the other 45% is going and who's claiming those GHG emission credits in the region. And then secondly, on the tour, there was conversation about Millstone 1, I guess one of the units that was not down, but thinking ahead about developing new technology there. So just thinking if we can have a curve that has to deal with nuclear on here as well. And biomass if we can get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could definitely include those. Supplies for those definitely operate on different principles than renewable energy, but there's no reason why we couldn't include them. And on the next slide, we at least have a snapshot in terms of how much solar, biogas, and nuclear could contribute compared to some of these other resources. But in the interest of time, I think we do have one more question, and then after that, we'll move on to the next slide.
Colin, quick question on the electrolyzer, on the comment where it says electrolyzers using grid power could be under $2 in 2030. This one does it assume full PTC?
No, so there would be no PTC in 2040. This one assumes that electrolyzers are able to connect as a transmission service customer, which the information we've been given is that it carries a tariff of around 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is extremely cheap power, but is basically allowing the electrolyzer to access wholesale prices, in my understanding. Definitely some assumptions that we could revisit, and it doesn't include, to the point made earlier, additional costs for transmission that we were required to allow the grid to service a customer the size of an electrolyzer wherever it decides to be located. But those are the assumptions that are sort of underlying that.
Okay, so yeah, I agree with the previous comment, and it's going to be extremely difficult to get to the $2.
We'll make sure we include those caveats more clearly in the future.
Okay. Well, pending any other questions from folks, Colin, let's go ahead and move forward to infrastructure if you wouldn't mind.
No problem. So looking at maybe going a bit deeper into that supply analysis and connecting it to the question of infrastructure, we see that although there's technically potentially a lot of ability to produce hydrogen in and around Connecticut, the location of that production would likely not be directly, it would might be difficult to co-locate that production with large end users as the industry scales up. You can see here that the areas of Connecticut where wind and solar production potential are the highest, largely the northwest and southeast of the state, are not necessarily located in close proximity to the potential end users, which are largely clustered in the middle of the state and in the southwest. Offshore wind interconnection points, similarly, are somewhat distant. There may be some opportunity to co-locate in the Bridgeport area, but overall, it's likely that some type of connecting infrastructure will be required to connect end users and hydrogen production in the state. That would that be pipeline or truck delivery will largely depend, I think, on the scale of hydrogen required, with pipelines becoming a more economic option, likely if end use scales up to the point where it's economic. But just to give a sense of sort of the geographic dispersion of hydrogen use and production in the state, this is a good graph for that. I see there's still a hand up. Not sure if that's a holdover from the last set of questions or.
I think that one's a holdover, Sridhar. Okay, yep.
Excellent. Well, in that case, happy to pass off the mic to the next presenter for the. Oh, I'm sorry. There is actually one more slide on infrastructure. Now, when we're looking outside the state and really looking at a scaled up industry for hydrogen in Connecticut, in the Northeast region as a whole, as you get to higher levels of hydrogen use, the economies of scale and the use patterns for the mismatch between production and use of hydrogen will likely require large-scale storage of hydrogen, which is often most cost-effective in geologic deposits, the closest of which are located in Pennsylvania and Western New York. In these cases, pipelines are often the most efficient way and cost-effective way to transport hydrogen to and from storage locations. We have here some of the existing pipelines within Connecticut where rights of ways could be utilized to provide that transportation to and from storage. However, to the extent possible, co-locating hydrogen production and demand can help reduce the need for storage, as can, for that matter, combining solar and wind production to produce hydrogen, because the different load profiles or production profiles of solar and wind would allow you to produce hydrogen at a more constant rate, which would be provide a better production profile for end users who need a constant supply of hydrogen. And so a number of considerations to look at and a number of additional investigation to be developed to understand the optimal way to structure a system like this in the Northeast. Pausing for more questions or jumping on to the next slides?
I do. So definitely welcome questions from folks. I think one thing I do want to flag here is, we got a lot of questions on the sources section, essentially pointing out, hey, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on besides just production, and those pieces, especially as we think about interconnection, transport, et cetera, can be quite costly. And so just wanted to acknowledge, that the sources analysis was specifically focused on production, and some of the work that was done through the infrastructure work stream was intended to kind of close some of those gaps between, hey, we can produce relatively low cost hydrogen, just when we think about, energy supply, but there are a number of other pieces. And so we definitely welcome feedback from folks on places where we can add some sort of kind of color commentary on lived experience and what it's actually going to take. But unless there's any questions, we are just a little bit behind schedule here. So I'm just going to bump us along to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Colin. Lily, the floor is all yours.
All righty. Hi, everybody. My name is Lily. I had the pleasure of guiding the funding working group, which was so much fun. And we have one more coming up on Thursday. So plug if you'd like to join and provide a little bit more feedback on recommendations related to funding. So at a high level, the funding working group primarily investigated 3 areas. So we looked at opportunities for federal funding for hydrogen within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We also looked at other potential sources of funding for hydrogen infrastructure and production, and really the entire value chain. Specifically, we looked at the IRA, state funding opportunities, and other federal funding opportunities. And we also looked at the potential to utilize brownfields, remediation and repurposing of brownfields for hydrogen-fueled infrastructure in the state. We found that there's funding available in the IIJA across the hydrogen value chain, including end-use specific funding and then enabling funding in manufacturing, workforce development, and other key areas. 2 areas that we found would be essential for being competitive for competitive solicitations in the IIJA would be committing to achieving the objectives of Justice 40, which we'll speak about shortly, and ensuring adequate sources of non-federal match funding. And as a part of our legislative mandate, we also delved a bit deeper into Connecticut's Targeted Loan Development Program. And we actually discovered a suite of tools that could be applied for remediation and restoration of brownfields for hydrogen development. So first off, we delved into the IIJA. So at the highest level, many of us are already aware of some of the major funding opportunities that are directly noted for hydrogen, but we also uncovered some of the less talked about funding that would still potentially be applicable to hydrogen-related projects and infrastructure. This is just a sampling shown here, but the report will contain a much more comprehensive list of some potential options. In terms of federal funding opportunities that folks may be already aware of, we know that the state of Connecticut is teaming up with others in the Northeast for a very exciting hubs proposal. And this opportunity, I would say, is probably the best known, but the report will cover many other opportunities for federal and state level funding. Many of the programs within the IIJA are also covered by the Biden administration's Justice 40 executive order, which directs that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal incentives must flow towards disadvantaged communities. So the federally recognized definition for a disadvantaged community is a community that ranks in the 80th percentile with in a cumulative sum of multiple burden indicators. It has at least 30% of the households classified as low income, although my working group aptly noted that many environmental justice advocates have noted that this does not include race as a criterion to assess disadvantaged communities, and this could be a predictor of communities that face disproportionate environmental burdens. So just something we noticed, that it's not necessarily viewed as the gold star in all communities of how we're defining disadvantaged communities and where federal funding can make a huge impact for clean energy projects. So some of the ways that this is coming to life within the IIJA, there is the funding opportunity announcement for the H2 hubs that I referenced earlier includes actually 20% of the proposal is going to be weighted towards a community benefits plan in which applicants will demonstrate how they're going to carry out meaningful community and labor engagement, how they're going to invest in the American workforce, advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and contribute to the Justice 40 initiative. So we can expect that to carry through in a lot of other federal funding opportunities. So another thing to note is that many, though not all, of the competitive IIJA funding opportunities will require applicants to commit varying levels of non-federal match funding. So this, as I mentioned, will vary. While the H2 Hubs application will require a 50% non-federal cost share, many of the clean transportation grants and programs only require between 10 to 20. And this funding can come in a variety of forms, from financing to private sector and project participant funding, and also through state level resources as well. And so we also looked at a variety of different funding programs at the state level that could be considered as matches. It's important to note, and something we uncovered along the way, is that some further legal analysis may be required to understand the eligibility of some of these sources and different funding mechanisms to ensure that they could work as match funding. There may be nuances that get uncovered along the way. Moving along, since I know we are limited on time, we also delved, as I mentioned, a bit into the Targeted Loan Development Program, the state of Connecticut's Targeted Brownfield Loan Program. While our legislative mandate was specifically to look into the loan program, we discovered a whole toolbox that goes beyond this. Focusing in on loans and grants, there's opportunities for recipients to get between $2 million in grants and $4 million in loans to remediate brownfields. These programs are not designated for specific end uses, so they wouldn't need to necessarily be adapted to ensure that funding would be applicable to support remediation or repurposing of brownfields for hydrogen facilities and infrastructure. However, while funding isn't designated for a specific end use, the proposals are scored competitively based on a rubric that's defined in each funding cycle. So in the most recent grant cycles, renewable energy projects were given an additional scoring credit. Some of the different eligible uses of this funding would be remediation of brownfields, building and structural issue, remediation related to brownfields, planning and engineering, addressing soil, groundwater, and other infrastructure issues. So while these funds may not be applicable to the direct costs of developing hydrogen-related infrastructure and facilities, they may be applied to some of the pre-construction costs, like demolition of the previous contaminated facilities. These would definitely provide net financial benefit to project developers, but further research may be considered to assess whether it could be applicable to a match funding requirement, any of these pre-construction costs. We also delved a bit into the Inflation Reduction Act, which was enacted in August. This graphic demonstrates that ultimately the benefits from the IRA are incredibly significant, even compared to the IIJA. So there's tons of opportunity. We specifically explored the production tax credit, which is a 10-year incentive for hydrogen production facilities that begin construction by 2023. It provides a scaled system where you get increasing credit with lower carbon intensity that's meant to incentivize decarbonized pathways and level the playing field for clean hydrogen technology. We also looked into the investment tax credit and other opportunities in the IRA, which will be outlined in the report. So as one of our work streams deliverables, we have provided a comprehensive list of these opportunities. So we welcome your feedback on any provisions that we may have missed. We'll be sending that out with the report as an appendix. And we will also be reviewing a bit more about this content in my working group. So feel free to join me on Thursday.
Question in the room.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Alex Isaac again from Fuel Cell. Just a question on funding.
Yeah.
Because, we don't want to look at Connecticut in a silo, but looking at it from a perspective of a regionalized player, especially when we're talking about hydrogen hubs. Is there any consideration into making reference to what some of our neighboring states have recently announced by way of grants specific for hydrogen? I know that you spent a lot of time And I know the detail that went into looking at the existing programs that are in Connecticut that might be able to be retrofitted. But given that this is a report where we're putting recommendations forward, maybe a recommendation should be, new grants made available with hydrogen specifically in mind, so that hydrogen is not competing with other technologies for the application of those funds. And there's not the additional administrative burden of trying to figure out whether or not the projects are applicable for those funds, but it's able to thread that needle perfectly because that's what it's set up for. I also think if we look at what our neighbors in, say, New York and some of the other states are doing, it'll give guidance to our legislature to know that significant funds are being designated specifically for hydrogen-related projects.
Definitely. We get into some of that in our recommendations, but I will say we tried to ground a lot of our recommendations in practices from other states. So you'll see in the report a lot of references to how other states are approaching potential new grants or funding opportunities.
Thank you.
Any other comments before we move forward? Maybe.
Thanks so
Go
much,
ahead, Jen.
Lily.
All right, Joe, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Lily. Hi, everyone. As part of our activities in the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group, we provided a review of regulations and legislation needed to guide the development of hydrogen. And this really helps serve as a readiness assessment. And so we can move to the next slide. In general, Connecticut policy does provide support for the development of clean hydrogen, which I'll discuss in further detail in a bit. And there are some existing policies that specifically reference hydrogen, but there are also some opportunities for policy to be furthered or strengthened. A review of best practices for hydrogen also does show a trend in establishing a definition for clean hydrogen in order to remove ambiguity and help enable hydrogen development. Lastly, further policy actions can help drive development of a hydrogen ecosystem, including potential measures that support workforce development and a just transition for fossil workers and other training and upscaling efforts. In addition, actions that incorporate community engagement principles can be a part of it, and actions that support priority hydrogen use cases and encourage general market development. So on the next slide, we'll just take a moment to reiterate what some of the other work groups have been looking at and finding. I know you just heard all this too, so I won't spend too much time here, but those findings did help inform our work, and they get incorporated into our findings and ultimately our recommendations from this working group. So as we heard, the sources working group found that renewables such as wind and solar can be the lowest cost sources for clean hydrogen production. Of course, with the state's decarbonization goals for the power sector, there may be some competition for use of renewables. On the uses side, the highest priority use cases were identified with focus on those that are very likely to use hydrogen and have the potential to create substantial societal benefits, or are in otherwise difficult to abate areas where hydrogen may be the only known zero carbon energy source. The infrastructure working group focused on the potential need for the deployment of at-scale hydrogen infrastructure and offtake opportunities, and the importance of incorporating stakeholder community feedback throughout that process. And as we heard from Lily, the funding working group found that there are significant dollars available for hydrogen, and that the state should aim to maximize access to those resources. So with those in mind, we'll go through some of the existing policies that can help support development consistent with those findings. So first off, we have seen that Connecticut does have a very strong decarbonization policy, which it helps provide general support for the development of clean hydrogen to contribute to some of these goals here. Connecticut General Statute 22A requires greenhouse gas emissions reduction statewide, while Public Act 225 requires zero emissions specifically from the electric sector by 2040. This is supported by Connecticut's Renewable Portfolio Standard, which sets annual targets for shares of electric generation from renewable sources. Additionally, Connecticut has set limits for emissions of nitrogen oxides from fuel burning equipment and stationary sources. And the state is also part of a multi-state zero emissions medium and heavy duty vehicle memorandum of understanding to set goals for zero emissions vehicles. So for policies more related to hydrogen specifically, of course, we have Special Act 22A8, which establishes this Hydrogen Power Study Task Force. We can move ahead to the next slide. Some other potential policies here, or existing policies, I should say, sorry. We know developers of 2 megawatt or greater Class 1 renewable energy projects are required to ensure that community benefit agreements are entered into and to ensure a workforce development program. And of course, in Connecticut, fuel cells are classified as Class 1 resource. Connecticut General Statutes 16244 and 16A3 are related to fuel cells. They set competitive processes for EDC procurement, and they note that DEEP may solicit proposals for Class 1 resources to meet EDC load. I mentioned that multi-state medium and heavy duty vehicle MOU, which sets goals to achieve 30% zero emissions vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Connecticut has also directed the development of a zero emissions bus implementation plan, and the state also has a rebate program for zero emissions vehicles, including hydrogen and EVs. Regarding in-state resource planning, it can also support the development of clean hydrogen. Executive Order 21.3 directs DEEP to include in the next comprehensive energy strategy a set of strategies to provide more affordable heating and cooling, achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from residential buildings and industrial facilities, and improve the resilience of the state's energy sector. And hydrogen could potentially be a part of those strategies. And with the 2020 state IRP, there was discussion of clean hydrogen as a strategy to reduce electric sector emissions. So I also want to note here on the next slide that we did look at Connecticut policy and funding programs related to hydrogen. Many of those involve fuel cells. Lily covered some of this already in her discussion in the funding work group activities. So I'll spare folks me walking through each of these, especially in the interest of time. But I mentioned the zero emissions vehicle rebates through the CHEAPER program. There's also potential for grants to expand hydrogen and fuel cell industries and some tax incentives for Class 1 resources. But I think we just heard a few moments ago too, certainly some room here for additional grants to be created specifically related to hydrogen. And so moving on, what we're seeing developed elsewhere has also helped inform our best practices. So I did want to talk through some of the actions that we're seeing in other jurisdictions. As the topic of hydrogen has been raised across the US and elsewhere, we're seeing more policies implemented, particularly related to clean hydrogen. In the past 3 years, hydrogen-specific legislation has been increasing. We've seen about 120 hydrogen-related bills passed, and about a third of those have involved clean, green, or renewable hydrogen definitions. In general, hydrogen-related bills have been focused on particular end uses such as mobility, industry, or the gas or electric sectors. Of those, mobility has been by far the most common, and a smaller set of hydrogen-related bills have provided grant funding or authorized studies or addressed safety provisions for the storage or transport of hydrogen. Related to the definition of clean hydrogen, states and other countries are developing definitions for hydrogen eligibility, and they're starting to follow a similar trend. Increasingly, and based on federal guidance now, we're seeing definitions based on life cycle carbon intensity range, but we've also seen definitions that incorporate additional specification, focused on allowable feedstocks such as renewable or non-fossil fuels. So a little more on the hydrogen definition. We see here on this next slide that there are, multiple paths for producing hydrogen, and each has, varying levels of associated emissions. So if we're thinking about the state's clean energy goals, there are some sources that may not be consistent with those goals, particularly if we're looking at hydrogen as a tool for decarbonization. So this suggests that a definition may need to account for these differences through measures of emissions intensity or feedstocks or means of production. So some examples of how other jurisdictions have been approaching this. We see that Montana has a definition of green that's technology agnostic, but excludes the use of fossil fuels. a similar methodology in Oregon, but they're calling it renewable hydrogen rather than green hydrogen. In other areas, France, an example here, the definition is based on carbon intensity, and recently, DOE has sort of taken this approach in their federal guidance. And so, speaking of which, on the next slide, guidance from the proposed clean hydrogen production standard has established clean hydrogen as that with less than 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen on a well-to-gate basis. And the use of this definition removes ambiguity with the colors of hydrogen. So we've increasingly seen definitions move, away from that framework, and it allows for a standardized methodology to assess hydrogen on a technology neutral basis. An intensity framework can also, include a threshold and a certification scheme to account for greenhouse gas emissions rising at both the site of production and upstream of production. I'll also note here that alignment of a state's definition to at least meet the federal guidance from the IIJA and the proposed clean hydrogen standard, that can be important if you want to unlock access to federal funding opportunities. So shifting to workforce development for a moment here on this next slide. Hydrogen does have some overlap with fossil fuels in infrastructure and skill sets needed, such as pipe fitting or boiler making. So there's an opportunity to build off of existing training programs and also to retrain the existing fossil fuel workforce to enable these workers to participate in the state's transition to clean energy. So there are a number of opportunities for both repurposing and retraining, while also building off of Connecticut's existing expertise in hydrogen technologies. So some key findings here. First, community outreach can have a very important role in workforce development. Engagement with community leaders and partnering with other groups can help connect local workers with training and upscaling efforts, and presents an opportunity to reach populations that have been traditionally underrepresented in the energy workforce. Environmental justice, is one of those cross-cutting themes of our work here. So as we're talking about best practices for community engagement as part of workforce development strategies and just transition, we really need that EJ focus. Community benefit agreements, I mentioned already, existing policy requiring these agreements for projects of 2 megawatts or greater. These can help ensure the development of workforce training programs and create additional local job opportunities through provisions that require commitments to use local workers, prevailing wage requirements, and partnerships with some of those existing apprenticeship and training programs. Speaking of existing programs, there are frameworks in place that can be expanded upon, modeled after, or altered to include skill sets related to hydrogen projects. The Connecticut State Building Trades Training Institute is one example here. We actually had them present at one of our working group meetings. And I mentioned some of those overlapping skill sets, such as pipe fitting or boiler making. There are training programs for many of these skills that can be adapted as needed or built upon through additional partnerships with programs and with other local labor groups. And of course, there is already extensive expertise in Connecticut with fuel cells. That experience can be leveraged, right? And again, some of the existing trades programs can be looked at as a model for potentially developing new programs, perhaps related to electrochemical technologies. And the University of Connecticut also, of course, deep knowledge and expertise in hydrogen technologies. So these are resources that can really help jumpstart Connecticut in preparing the future workforce. Okay, I kind of flew through that, I know, in the interest of time, but I want to pause now here just for any comments or questions related to our findings in the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group.
Alex, please, here in the room.
Hi, thank you again. Just a quick question on the or not question, but comment on the last point you have there on the slide with the existing fuel cell industry. You talked about jump starting. I would argue that it's already started, and based on my workforce at Fuel Cell Energy, as well as we're here at HyAxium, it may be beneficial to Connecticut legislatures to just put in a note about what the expected market is on both the US and global scale for hydrogen. On several of the slides, you talked about how this is a global conversation that's happening. If we could see what the global market size is and the fact that you have key producers here in the state, thinking about what the state could do to continue to grow and incentivize our industry to grow itself here, if you will, and that while the end production of hydrogen that will be utilized here in Connecticut is very important and part of the majority of what our presentation to the legislature is going to be about. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the economic benefit that the global market is going to have on Connecticut because of the fact that you have those key producers here in the state.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think provides a really important context. I think you're right about that. So thanks so much. Appreciate that. Any other questions or comments on our findings from this working group?
Just a quick point here in the room, just thanking all of you. Like, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that work. I mean, we're working through it really quickly in this conversation, but just a big thank you to everybody who dug into the working groups, the analyses, and pulling all that together. This is one of the big aspects of the Special Act, is what are our findings across those 7 areas. We've got a lot of great feedback today that will build into this, but just again, a big thank you for all the heavy lifting that's been done to get us to findings. And now, that really leads us to then, okay, well, from all of that, what does that mean? What are our recommendations? So we'll turn it back over to you, Erin, to guide us through.
Thank you so much, Brian. Yes, I know I can hear in the room, everyone's like, yeah, these findings are great. Let's talk about what we do with them. So we appreciate everyone giving us some space to sort of talk through this kind of background body of research before moving into the recommendations. But just to kick us off on the recommendations, on the next slide, we just wanted to sort of contextualize for folks how we are approaching the recommendation. So we're really looking at actions that can be taken in Connecticut to support hydrogen deployment and development in the state. And we're looking at 3 main groups of actors, right? The first one being the legislature, who will be instrumental to the extent that we want to address changes in statute or tax codes, creating like broader transparency on some of these processes, and allocating funding, right? So these are some big areas where we're going to be looking to the legislature. When we think about the role of state government agencies, these are really in places where we know further investigation is going to be needed, where we need to be taking a look at some of the existing programs or incentives, and to the points I think that have been raised, think about how they could apply to hydrogen. Potentially digging into where and how might additional funding be needed. And again, creating that space for broad-based stakeholder engagement, particularly community engagement, as we move forward with this hydrogen infrastructure and end uses. Last and definitely not least is industry and academia. I know we're hearing from a whole bunch of great representatives from Connecticut's hydrogen industry today. And I think something that when we think of that group of folks, definitely have a real leadership role in pursuing some of these federal funding opportunities, in engaging with the development of a hydrogen workforce, and also continuing to advance some of the research that has made this possible today. So as we step into these recommendations, just want to remind everyone with a big exclamation point, recommendations are still draft. We definitely welcome feedback, places where we can continue to tune these. Lily mentioned she's got a work group coming up on Thursday. We will have work groups for covering all of this. So there's going to be plenty of time to discuss, but we wanted to give folks kind of an overview lay of the land here before we step into some of those deeper conversations in working groups. So take this as a starting point for how we're engaging with folks on recommendations. And with that, let's go ahead and get into it. So when we look at the role of the legislature, there were 2 really big areas where we felt like the legislature could provide some leadership. Yep, go ahead to that next slide. The first is really around community engagement and resources. So something that we found is that there could potentially be a lot of value in helping to create access to information. Some of the resources or information is kind of buried in a lot of other sources, and so making sure that cities, municipalities, local applicants have access to that information could be really, really hugely valuable. The other thing that we've been hearing pretty clearly from communities is staying abreast with everything that's going on. It can be a pretty significant effort of work, as folks are just seeing from today. Right. And so if Connecticut is really interested to make sure that communities have some space to engage, they may need funding support in order to be able to do that. And the last piece on the community side is, we heard a lot about Public Act 22-43 and sort of the importance of community benefit agreements. And so there is some opportunity to update that to make sure it's really comprehensive in covering the full potential range of hydrogen projects. The other big area is around kind of end uses and specifically how the state is thinking about creating space for some of the highest value end uses that we saw today. So one big piece is, there's actually quite a number of multi-sectoral offtake opportunities that really have some common underpinning infrastructure requirements. So things like fueling stations will end up supporting a whole variety of end-use applications. And so there is some real opportunity here for the legislature to be looking at that huge list of funding opportunities that Lily pulled together, thinking about some of these real enabling opportunities and thinking about where state funding can really help with some of those federal MASH requirements and sort of catalyzing some of these infrastructure requirements that we know will be extremely necessary for end use customers and being able to make hydrogen affordable for some of the end users. We also want to invite the legislature to be thinking about places for tax exemptions to play a role, especially for hydrogen vehicles or critical facilities. These are some of the end uses that were flagged as areas where we think there's some real value where hydrogen can play a big role. And the last piece is some of these harder to electrify sectors. So if you think back to some of the slides that Colin showed you, when he was looking at prices, he was saying, hey, there are some price points where likely if the state is really interested to decarbonize, those will have to be facilitated and enabled through some policy action. We can't solely expect market forces to be decarbonizing some of these sectors as fast as we might want to. So, but these are much bigger questions, right? These are some pretty big, substantial questions about how we decarbonize some really large sectors of the economy, right? Aviation, shipping, industrial processes. And so it is helpful to think about the role that hydrogen can play there, but we don't want folks to necessarily presume that that's the right answer for everyone without giving it some due space. So definitely encourage making that space so that the state can be thinking about the role of hydrogen in those sectors. So this is sort of, I'm going to pause here because this is some of the key things we're asking from the legislature, and I want to give folks a chance to provide any thoughts, questions, feedback before we move on to how we're thinking about the role of state government agencies.
We have a comment in the room. So I would just say that on the grant funding down below, I think it's great to apply that, as you said, to things that are going to be really impactful. But the other side of the coin I would want to see emphasized there is to also put Connecticut on a more level playing field with other states. Because if we're competing with New York and others that are in California that already do that, it makes it more difficult for companies to compete on those federal grants.
Yeah, that's great feedback. That's really great feedback. Okay. Well, maybe we'll keep walking through recommendations and create space to come back to this if folks have any further comments as we walk through things. Okay. So just to give folks a sense of where we were focusing when we were talking about state government agencies, Deep, Pura, DECD, thank you so much for your engagement throughout this process. It's been wonderful to have you participating in the work groups and the task force, and we're excited to be handing some of the next steps off to you. Just to give folks a sense of how this is coming together, we are really looking at DEEP as sort of the agency that has kind of core responsibility around energy and environmental planning. And so you'll see to the extent that there are actions and next steps that focus in that area, those have been directed towards DEEP. Pura, we're really looking at the role that EDCs can play in some of this hydrogen planning and infrastructure deployment, and so are asking them to be the lead on places where that comes up. And then, of course, DECD really continuing to make sure that those brownfield funding opportunities are a part of the full portfolio. We also have some opportunities for the Office of Workforce Strategy, and I want to caveat that I think they're not in the room today, and so we do want to make sure that we're appropriately calibrating with them before those move forward. But we do have some workforce development opportunities. Okay, so let's get into some of the stuff for DEEP. So DEEP has been a great participant in this process, and we're excited for you to be kind of a key player in helping to continue to enable the statewide vision for clean hydrogen. So when we think about sort of some of the big areas where we're asking state agencies to take action, and specifically DEEP, we're looking obviously at production and how we think about planning for production, and that's come up a bunch today. We are thinking about those end uses and specifically how the state is continuing to advance its thinking on some of the, potentially most valuable end uses. And then last, but again, definitely not least, is this topic of ecosystem engagement and how we're continuing to create forums for folks to come together, share perspectives, share opinions, come to consensus about how the state should be moving forward. So when we think about production specifically, one of the topics that has been coming up quite frequently is this question about the definition of clean hydrogen and establishing a state-specific definition. Something that we've seen is that this definition is super duper duper technical. And so it's important to make sure that we're creating some space and technical rigor around that definition. We also want to make sure that as we are thinking about some of the zero emission electricity supply and sources, that is being taken comprehensively into these states' overall planning activities, right? We know that renewables are going to be a key part of both electric sector decarbonization as well as hydrogen production, and that needs to be integrated more holistically in order to make sure that we're planning that well. And then the other piece on here, and I know this came up from some folks today, is just thinking about accounting mechanisms and certifying the carbon intensity of produced hydrogen, right? We're seeing this across the board, especially as folks are thinking about accessing grid power, accessing renewables, et cetera. When we turn to hydrogen end uses, we definitely want to think about, where it is appropriate to have policy and market development support for hydrogen production and some of the highest priority end uses that have been discussed today, right? I think folks have come out from industry, have come out loud and clear saying, hey, you've got some numbers on here. We feel like they may be overly rosy. We're really trying to make this work. And it is highly likely that we need some help to do that in the near term. And so just thinking about where is appropriate for the state to support that. We also know that there's a lot of hydrogen efforts going on, the hub being just one of them. And we definitely want to make sure that some of the end uses that we've discussed in this process are really well coordinated with all of the other efforts that are going on across the state. Going along with this topic of policy and market development support, there's definitely some clear opportunities around carbon intensity of fuels. And so looking into to that and the role of hydrogen as a low carbon fuel, and potentially looking at, in the similar vein, clean transportation incentives, especially for some of the end use applications that we've identified are going to be cost effective in the near term. So port handling equipment being one of them, but also looking at things like harbor crafts, ocean going vessels, et cetera. So making sure that we're thinking about some of these maritime applications. On the ecosystem engagement piece, something that has become really, really clear is that when we talk about hydrogen and how we're thinking about hydrogen, it's going to include a lot of folks and a lot of agencies. And so there's definitely going to be value in bringing all of these folks together to be on the same page, to make sure that the state is thinking in a coordinated fashion about how it wants to move forward with hydrogen. As the state is thinking about some of this, there is absolutely a huge need to be making sure that equity and environmental justice participants are a part of the conversation, are being heard, and that community impact, environmental justice, and energy equity are front and center in some of these conversations about hydrogen. That has been extremely clear to us throughout this entire process. And then the last piece, of course, is working with all of the stakeholders here, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other ones, to think about the statewide vision for clean hydrogen, thinking about potential backbone or infrastructure requirements, making sure that this is all done in consultation with so many of the ecosystem stakeholders who have showed up for our conversations these past months. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm also, if anyone from DEEP wants to show up and chime in or provide any color commentary on what we've laid out here, I think that would be extremely welcome.
Hi, Erin. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's working. Well, we definitely welcome the comments. We were actually expecting also to receive some of those recommendations also from the task force. This is important for our policy process, and I'm glad to see that some of the comments, the recommendations, are actually some things that are already in place in initial stages, but they are already in place, such as our white paper on hydrogen that we are starting with support of a consulting company as well. And it will be part of the comprehensive energy strategy, and there will be multiple engagement opportunities also for folks to engage and also give their feedback to us and comments. And also we are very much interested and look forward to have this engagement with the communities through our CJAC. Of course, the CJAC work is something that we work on coordination with them, so we have to have them also on board of what topics are going to be on the CJAC discussions. But I know that they are very much interested already on the hydrogen, so I'm pretty sure that this will not be a problem to also use this council that it's working so well for Connecticut also to develop the engagement with communities. So yeah, we have all those process already going on, and we look forward also to receive comments of all of you and others throughout this process. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Any additional questions or comments from folks at this point? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the roles of some of the other agencies in this process. So when we look at how we're asking PURA, DECD, and the Office of Workforce Strategy to be engaged, the list is a little bit shorter than how we're asking DEEP to be leading on this front, but we did identify a couple of specific opportunities. So for PURA, looking at the role of stationary fuel cells, as we discussed during the end uses or the uses section, and talking about how to incorporate fuel cells either for backup power, for peak power, into some of their existing planning venues. We also have heard from folks that ability to access low-cost energy from the grid is going to be really important to end production. And so looking at some of the existing tariffs for renewable energy, flexible or interruptible load, et cetera, understanding whether or not those would work well for electrolytic hydrogen production, or whether an additional tariff might be needed to create space for this. For DECD, really focusing on the brownfield load programs, evaluating if there's need for additional funding to be supporting some of these hydrogen opportunities, making sure that program is continuing to hum along and be just such a great resource for everyone. Office of Workforce Strategy, we're looking at them to help lead coordination between some of these existing entities to really get a more robust workforce development plan and workforce development strategy in place. I know I'm continuing to see some comments in the chat about the opportunity here and the fact that, when we're talking about workforce, there is real opportunity to be accessing some of this global marketplace and make sure that Connecticut is really reaping some of the value there. We also know that local universities, local colleges are a big part of building out that workforce. And so making sure there are clear lines of communication there, and that some of these local academic institutions are able to be a part of the solution. And then the next slide, one other thing we do want to flag is that there are a whole bunch of opportunities where interagency coordination will be required. We're going to be asking, various agencies to work together. So, for example, both DEEP and PURA have a number of existing clean energy programs that could be eligible to hydrogen. And I know there were some comments in the chat about, hey, it would be really helpful if we could get clarification on hydrogen eligibility, understanding what that might mean for the program writ large. But really digging in on that front, similarly asking DEEP and DECD to continue to maintain the brownfields inventory, as that is a really important resource for folks to be able to understand opportunities. Kathy, I see your hand. I'm just going to walk through this and then go back to you. Permitting and safety is something that has come up for a couple of folks, and so making sure that the relevant agencies and stakeholders are able to participate in discussions about permitting of hydrogen infrastructure and what it looks like to create a smooth path for folks to be able to get those permits and have timely project development. Similarly, making sure that hydrogen safety is really in people's minds, and that there's kind of a clear line of communication between some of the local organizations that may be tasked with dealing with some of those hydrogen safety questions, and a whole bunch of the federal organizations that are already working on looking into a lot of these questions. And so making sure that those lines of communication are open and a resource for everyone. And then on the community protection side, really just thinking about some of the tools to make sure that the communities are able to be involved in these processes and voice their questions, concerns, and thoughts. And again, really thinking about how we make the resources and funding available to those communities. And then last but definitely not least, looking into some of these brownfields and kind of sanity checking community support, community benefit agreements, et cetera, so that communities can be involved in that process. Okay. And so that, I believe, is it for our government agency recommendation. So with that, maybe Kathy, if you want to go ahead and chime in here.
Yeah, just back on your slide 49, I
Yeah.
would really like to see that last bullet say partner with local universities, community colleges, and trade schools. I'd be interested in colleagues' reactions, but I know for us, the big gap is trades and technicians, and also I think it plays well with the hydrogen pump.
I agree. I agree.
And Kathy, if I could just segue in as well, I think maybe making a comment to have Paul LeBoy, who's the Connecticut chief, I'm not going to forget his title, chief manufacturing officer, involved specifically, or at least that that role involved might bring another dynamic to the conversation, and also layer in oversight and involvement through the executive branch by having him be involved in the discussion.
And I asked them that I'm Rick Mullins from Infinity. I spent 23 years in workforce development in the state of Connecticut with Central Connecticut State University and economic development. And my boss, Bill Smith's on his committee. I'm here today in his absence. But hearing what Kathy mentioned and Alex followed up with, one thing in all those years in higher ed, working with the Department of Labor, Department of Economic Community Development, and so forth, I've always seen critical is having some form of a roadmap that connects the vocational technical high schools, the community colleges, the regional comprehensive universities, and the land grant institutions on the planning of these activities rather than reactionary after the fact, because often things change downstream and the reaction time is delayed in that area. So that was one comment. I was listening in most of the day today to hear how this was going to evolve. But I would really encourage you to think about forming some form of a roadmap and a task force, including those levels of higher ed and how they can integrate that into the infrastructure build out and sustainability. The other piece that I've listened to here today, I haven't heard a lot about an industry panel to follow up with this infrastructure build out. We've been down this road for many years here at the state with fuel cells, well over 30 years. And as this process evolves, the legislature should be aware of who's here, what we do, how we do it, how we got to where we got to, and let's take advantage of lessons learned in a collaborative way so that we can build this infrastructure out quickly, efficiently, and effectively, and not make mistakes that were made before. And then one final note, every time we talk about infrastructure build out, we forget to remember along the way, there are breaks in the process. What are we doing to support that using the technology so we don't lose consumer confidence? And I'm thinking about a lot of the portable hydrogen generation type resources that could be brought to bear as the infrastructure rolls out. They should be considered early on in the process, not after the fact, because then we're always running to catch up and we're going to lose consumer confidence. Thank you.
A couple of really helpful recommendations in there, so thank you for speaking up on that front. Okay, I know we are bumping up at the end of time here, and I do want to make sure we get through this and then create a little bit of space to talk about next steps and public comment. So I'm going to keep rolling, but I think something that we're hearing quite loudly here is that industry and academia do have a very substantial role to play, especially in hydrogen workforce development. So thank you everyone for helping to make that point. But definitely, encouraging folks to pursue federal funding, especially for manufacturing and of electrolyzers and fuel cells. Really making sure that we're also tapping the insurance industry, which I know is a pretty substantial industry in Connecticut and can help to sort of standardize some of the hydrogen insurance questions while simultaneously creating some additional workforce opportunities. And then, really, we've got UConn on here, but I know this applies probably to a broader set of academic institutions, but starting to identify opportunities to support that workforce development strategy, research and development, and potentially identify needed resources or funding to support that. So I know Brian and Sarah, we're closing in at the end of our time together. But I do want to, pause a little bit and create space if folks have any, overall questions or feedback on the recommendations that we've put together here before we talk about next steps.
Just one thing I'd like to see go into the recommendations, because I saw it throughout today's presentation, but then I didn't see it highlighted in the recommendations specifically, is the need for Connecticut not to be siloed in its next steps and next phases while it's thinking of definitions, while it's thinking of infrastructure. I think that Connecticut will benefit greatly from being a leader in a regionalized and quite frankly, a national conversation. And that's going to require the universities, the industries, as well as the state agencies to consistently be kind of checking in and evaluating what is happening not only in our neighboring states, but around the nation. So again, I saw that throughout the presentation today, but I think it warrants being listed in the actual recommendations as well.
That's great.
I'll throw another gold star out there just on the last bullet point. I feel like there's probably no other higher education institution in this country that has the leader of a university that's in perfect alignment with hydrogen and fuel cells than President Rudenka Mer, right? So like that's a competitive advantage to the state of Connecticut and everything that that institution plays with workforce development, innovation, and all the things that we've talked about. Just wanted to make that clear. All right, so still more work to do here through working groups. But Aaron, yeah, why don't we wind it down here?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about next steps and where folks can continue to get involved on these recommendations. So on the next slide, we've got the rest of our schedule from now until final report due to the legislature. So we do have our last set of December work group meetings coming up in the next couple of weeks. So please do get involved. These are going to be great opportunities to provide some additional feedback. We really welcome everyone coming in and sort of chiming in on ways that we can continue to tune these recommendations. We are planning to share the draft final report with the task force for review and feedback. We will be giving folks a relatively short turnaround time on that, just with the upcoming holidays and the need to get this report finalized in time for the legislature. But we will be doing that, distributing the final report text, and then voting out this report at our January task force meeting. So please feel free to reach out to any member of our team if you are interested to be involved in some of this and don't have these meetings on your calendar. We're happy to get you looped in. And just as a reminder on the next slide, work group meetings, but we've been progressing through this process and we're now down to our last set. So thank you so much, Brian, and I apologize for running a little bit long here, but turning the floor back over to you.
Great. So we are winding down here. Do we have anybody on the line who wants to provide public comments? Feel free to chat them through or raise your hand. We'll give it a moment, see if folks want to offer comments. All right, well, seeing none, just a final comment here. Let's go to the next slide. I wanted to make a point on let's go ahead and show the map. But as we were talking here today, our small state punches above its weight, right? I think there's been a broader point on the role Connecticut plays in the larger picture of hydrogen and fuel cell technology. We're gonna go for a tour now of Hyaxium and learn about their manufacturing process, what they're doing in the markets, and the like. But just really excited for all of us to have learned what's going on in and around the state of Connecticut. We're talking about greenhouse gas emission reductions, but we're also talking about economic development, from innovation to infrastructure, right? So lots of good feedback from folks. We now need to, looking ahead, start pulling all those pieces together. So we've got some working group meetings coming up, and then our final meeting is the 10th of January. So the second Tuesday of January, and then we've got the 15th to have everything pulled together to submit to the Energy and Technology Committee. So we'll be thinking about all that delivery and come back to you in January on those kind of next steps with hopefully everything assembled by then. What else? Anything else, Aaron, Sarah? Drew?
Can you go ahead one more slide?
Yeah, so there's our next meeting, the 10th of January, 10 to noon. Probably be back in the Bernard Baker Green Hydrogen Room. Where we started. We'll probably do some invites. They're not as big, but yes.
Location TV.
All right, with that, why don't we'll adjourn the meeting, and thank you everyone for a very productive meeting. We still got a lot of work to do, but if we don't touch base, everyone have a happy holidays, be safe, have fun, stay healthy, all those things. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Take care.
Aaron, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Enjoy the tour.
So we have